Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, I welcome you here this evening to our May lecture. Our lecture this evening will be given by Nessa O'Meara. On the 16th of May 1921, a group of men who were part of B Company, 5th Battalion of the Carlow Brigade, Irish Republican Army, ambushed a convoy of Royal Irish constabulary officers as they travelled through Barrowhouse. Two of the volunteers with the Carlow Brigade, who were both locals from Barrowhouse, were the only fatalities that day. Those young men were James Lacey and William Connor. As the centenary of the Barrowhouse Ambush approached, Nessa O'Meara, who is the great-grandniece of William Connor, one of the volunteers who died during the ambush, with the support of her granduncle William Connor, took on the endeavour to piece together the narrative of the Barrowhouse Ambush. And this important engagement had been sparsely documented and researched in the 102 years since the ambush. So during the upcoming Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, Nessa will take attendees through her research the importance of oral evidence and the importance of understanding the people involved and the families left behind. Nessa is a native of Barrowhouse and is a teacher of history and English in Carlow in Hackettstown. Her interest in history and local history stems from her parents and grandparents, and she's very proud of her family's connection to the War of Independence in Ireland. Her family has deep roots in the area, living in the locality for centuries. This lecture here, as you know, takes place this evening at the 17th of May, which is just one day after the 102nd anniversary of the ambush. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Nessa, and thank you so much, Nessa, for coming to talk to us this evening.
Hello everyone. Some say I won't need a microphone, so if I'm too loud, please tell me. I'm very grateful to have been asked to be here this evening by Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society. The event, the Barrowhouse Ambush, which took place during the War of Independence, is a testament really to the bravery and the resilience of the Irish people that have gone before us. And the Barrowhouse Ambush, unfortunately, was sparsely documented. I suppose I would like to begin tonight first by introducing myself, who I am, and how I came to be up here in front of you tonight. So my name is Nessa O'Meara Cardiff. Born and bred in Dunbryn Barrowhouse, I'm the baby of 4 to my parents Tina and the late Paddy O'Meara. By trade, I am a teacher of English and history in Carlow and Hackettstown, which is ironic because when we talk about the Carlow Brigade, Barrowhouse and Hackettstown, we're all in the same brigade, and my students of history in Carlow do love that too. When I was small, I loved stories. My mother always read, and I feel this was a huge influence on what was to come. My father always loved history and loved the natural history around him. We spent years working on the family tree, some issues solved, some issues not solved. I must admit, both my family lines have strong connections to the fight for Irish freedom. My mother is a native of Gracullen, with strong ties to the War of Independence, but also she's a granddaughter of MacDarby's Forge, or the blacksmith in Gracullen, which is a wealth of history in itself. When I would be in Gracullen visiting my grandparents, I was looking out upon the croppy graves. So it was hard to escape history when it was everywhere around me and my eyes had been open to it. It was through my father's line that I am the great-grandniece of William Connor, who was one of 2 men that died at the ambush site. I am extremely proud to be the great-grandniece of William Connor, And it is the pride that I have for what he did and sacrificed that gives me the courage to be able to stand in front of you all tonight. The Connor family have been in Barrowhouse for as far back as records can prove. And I'm very proud to say that my line of the family sees an unbroken chain of the family attending Barrowhouse National School from decades before William Connor attended to current day, with the two great-grandnieces of William Connor currently being in the school. So how did it come to this? Well, when I was around 11 years of age, I was completing a school project on the family tree. After completing my mother's side, I then asked my father for some help. He said he couldn't remember, or he didn't know any of the names. Now, he used to do this and say this so that I would go off and find for myself all this information and then come back and ask him, is this true? And he'd say, sure, I could have told you that. So I was sent on my way to find out my great-grandparents' names. I sat down with my granny, who was the niece of William Connor. After telling me the names I needed to know, she took me on a little bit of a swerve and told me the story of the Barrowhouse Ambush. I had heard of it, but it wasn't really spoken of. There was only a cross at the side of the road to mark its existence, and little literature existed. Like a good daughter, returning with names and now a big story, I would tell my father the story my granny told me, and you guessed he would tell me, sure, I could have told you that. It was then my mother produced a clipping from a newspaper. She had this clipping at this point for a number of years. The clipping was from the Kildare Nationalist, dated Friday the 14th of May 1993. And the clipping was an article. It was Eye on the Pass, number 34 by Frank Taff. Originally, when my mother had discovered this in 1993, she showed it to my father to see that it looked familiar to him, and he goes, yes, that's my people. No more, nothing less, just that's my people. It was the first time that the Barrowhouse Ambush had been given the written word in a substantial way. At the time this article was written, I was about 5 or 6, but my mother kept that article, and throughout the years showed me, just like when my granny started to tell me the story, what the article was. So we can fast forward a couple of years now, and we approach the centenary of the ambush. My father and I had discussed the ambush countless times at this point, but through one of many conversations around the kitchen table, we both agreed the narrative of the ambush is delicate and should be led by a family member, that all members of the ambush party, those who lived and those who died, will be treated fairly. And this is probably the main reason why I'm in front of you today. So before we plunge into the details of the ambush, it is essential to understand the historical context in which it occurred. The Irish War of Independence was a pivotal moment in Ireland's struggle for independence from British rule. The fight for freedom was characterised by numerous engagements, clandestine operations, and acts of resistance across the country. Now that I have established a brief background for you, I want to take you back to the early 1900s and ask you to do me one favour. I want you to put any concept you have of studying history aside. No more, nothing less. Just put that concept aside. My father knew his history. He loved his history. But his perspective on history is what influenced me the most. It can be very intimidating to talk about history, especially in front of an audience, as everyone assumes you know everything. That you can rattle off dates, and only if you knew the correct uniforms, the technology of warfare, can you really be called a historian. I don't believe this is true. I believe you can look at history in a variety of ways, and it's all relevant. However, I feel many tend to exclude looking at past events with historical empathy and looking beyond the uniforms and the weaponry and just look at people, the people involved, and look at the reasons why they became so active in these periods. And I feel it is when you look at this side of history, you begin to get a very rich exploration of the past. My father and I did not speak of military tactics, uniforms or weaponry. We discussed the people involved as people. What questioned them, what made them do the things they did, especially in the case of the ambush in Barrowhouse. And of course, to a degree, the wider country during the War of the Independence. Usually, it was normal people, normal working class people, who fought that battle. And that is what I want you to take away from tonight. That these men and women, what drove them to do it? Why did they get involved in this? What drove them, those men and women who were involved in the Barrowhouse ambush, to do what they did? They were ordinary working people like you and I, but they did something extraordinary. I don't want you to get bogged down in historical lingo or weaponry, lieutenants. I want you to leave here thinking, weren't they great people? Weren't they brave to stand up against an empire? Forget everything else and just think of the people who had enough of 800 years of colonisation and decided to stand up and make a stand. We will start at 1916 and head into the ambush from there. I wish I could cover the whole 800 years or so to give you a really good picture, but as tonight is short, I will go from 1916 onwards. After the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the world entered a chain of events that led to war, World War I in 1914. However, for the Irish nationalists, the war was a distraction to the British Empire and an opportunity to rebel against the Crown. We know and acknowledge that from a military perspective, the Easter Rising was unsuccessful. But in regards to propaganda, it served as a beacon of light to the generations that was in their teens and early 20s. When Pádraig Pearse called the young men and women in the country to arms, as he read the proclamation, his message was heard, it resonated, they believed them, and they wanted a better Ireland too. So it's at this point, I want you to remember what I said. Focus on the people and the bravery they had. So I would like to take a moment before I begin into the ambush and think of something in the country or the world that annoys or angers you at present. Absolutely anything. Is it a collective issue? Are many tormented about it? Is it on the news? Keeping what you have just thought about in mind, imagine that same fury that you're feeling right now, or maybe worse, is what people felt 100 odd years ago about being colonised. So you can just imagine if we had someone today to call us together on these issues that you were thinking of, just like Pearse rallied the troops for the War of Independence, would we just, us ordinary people, everyday people, be able to make such an impact? Or would we even bother to leave the couch? And that's what you need to remember. Would we leave the comfort of our own home? So when we are discussing historical events like the Barrowhouse Ambush, and we decide to analyse and critique, we need to ask ourselves, would we have done the same? Would we have left the kitchen table in the safety of our own homes? I think Pádraig Pearse said it best himself. To refuse to fight would have been to lose. To fight at all is to win. In 1916, William Connor, my great-granduncle, and James Lacey, his neighbour, along with other men from the locality, were in their late teens, early 20s. A lot of young men with a lot of living left to do. But they heard Pearse's call, like many others, and they believed him. The Easter Rising and the execution of its leaders backfired on the Crown. The Crown had hoped it would act as a deterrent to men and women across the country. Instead, the executions left a bitter taste and encouraged young men and women, like those in the Barrowhouse Ambush, to join their local brigades. My great-granduncle, William Connor, signed up to the Irish Volunteers and became a member of the Carlow brigade. He was only 21 years old when he heard Pearse's cry from the GPO. And like other men and women in the country, they accepted blood sacrifice. And if it meant they would die for the cause was worth it. That cause being Irish freedom. It was March of the following year, 1917, Connor joined the old Irish Republican Army that March. 18 months after William joined the Carlow Brigade, his friend and his neighbour, James Lacey, enlisted, which was September 1918. Having both joined the Irish Volunteers, both men were now part of the B Company, 5th Battalion of the Carlow Brigade. The ambush planned for Barrowhouse by members of the B Company was a retaliation attack. A servant on a local farm in Barrowhouse, owned by Mr. Lyons, was punished for stealing oats from his employer, and he was fined by a Republican court. These courts were quite typical of the time. Republican courts were established to show we could deal with our own affairs. However, after the servant had been fined by the Republican court, the servant came to the attention of the RIC. And in turn, he gave critical information, such as names, addresses of the Irish Republican Army in the area, and arrests were made. Therefore, the recent Republican court that was held eventually led to several arrests of the IRA men in the area, and it was actually the start of an arson attack on houses throughout the Barrowhouse locality. On the 16th of May, 102 years ago and a day, the RIC was again out in Barrowhouse to make more arrests on the back of the men holding a Republican court. It has always been alluded to that the RIC were just simply passing through Barrowhouse that day, so most assumed it had to be a straightforward route from Maganey to Battalion or vice versa. However, in James Lacey Sr.'s, James Lacey's father's report from the incident at the time, he states that the RIC were out to make arrests that day. And as we know, the members of the B Company lived scattered throughout Barrowhouse and Cullinagh and Maganey. The RIC could have been coming from anywhere. The route that makes most sense and corroborates the most with the little information we have is that the RIC took the main route down from Barrowhouse Crossroads towards the church and the school. So it is important to remember here the statement given by James Lacey's father. James Lacey Sr., which I just referenced, because if they were out to make arrests, the route they took may have been several. It could have been anywhere, depending on who they were looking for. I was extremely privileged to be given a copy of an interview conducted by Frank Taff with the late Joe O'Meara of Dunbryn, who was involved in the Carlow Brigade. The interview was done when Joe was 96 years of age. In that interview, Joe O'Meara described the setup of the ambush that day, and also describes the location of the planned ambush along with the route the RIC took. The route Joe claimed the RIC took was down from Barrowhouse Cross, heading for the school, and it's the same route which had been described when any of my family discussed the ambush, such as when my grandmother told me the story first. All of this suggests that the members of the ambush party did lay in wait at Keaton's Bridge, which to those not familiar with the landscape of Barrowhouse, it's halfway between Barrowhouse Crossroads and the church. Joe O'Meara's interview also indicates that the lookout was waiting near the school, most likely due to the children being in the school at the time. This also marries the oral history passed down through my family, that some of the men laid in wait behind the walls of the graveyard. Many people will argue this is not true, as the ambush group would have not had the time to cross from the bridge to the current ambush site. But as always, I'm willing to argue differently. If you stand halfway between Barrowhouse Crossroads and the school, which is called Keaton's Bridge, look in the direction of the ambush site, It would take approximately 10 minutes to run at pace, and remember, the RIC were on bikes because they dismounted and they walked as the children entered onto the road. By the time the RIC dismounted their bikes to walk, this also gave the ambush group more time to move across the fields. Another plausible route, if just for argument's sake, is that the ambush party's location was still at Keaton's Bridge, but instead of the RIC coming from the Barrowhouse Cross, it came from the direction of Whitebog, which is kind of more slightly towards the towards Athy direction. It changes very little after they reach the school, but it also makes sense because they could have come from Athy or Ballylinen direction, or, I said, if they were out making arrests, they could have come from anywhere. However, I am not one to argue with someone who said they were part of the B Company, even though others have, because the route has been continuously disputed. I have to give you all the facts. It is also important to know that Keaton's Bridge was called after a family called Keatings that lived in proximity to the bridge, and there was a short lane near that bridge not so long ago. The lane led up to some hay sheds at its dead end. But back in the day, those hay sheds were called Sinn Féin Hall. Later on, the night of the ambush, them sheds would be destroyed. I've also read at some point that it couldn't be Keaton's Bridge because the original location of the ambush site, as when the party relocated, they would have been seen running through the fields. Well, the Court of Inquiry into the deaths of James Lacey and William Connor was reported again in the Nationalist and Leinster Times. They reported that the inquiry stated five RIC were cycling near Shanganamore on the May 16th. The sergeant saw a man with a gun running across a field towards the road. Therefore, the men were seen in the fields, and this further proves that the ambush location, it was changed. So, if the ambush party left Keaton's Bridge to go diagonally across the fields, they would end up crossing through what we now know as Barrowhouse GA, which also meant they passed William Connor's home place in Cow Park. Another important point to remember when we're thinking of or talking of routes is landscape. The landscape, as we all know, has completely changed. Across from the ambush site where it is now, back then there was a laneway that would lead halfway through the fields, and if you continued, it would reach the road at Cow Park. Therefore, after crossing the current GA pitch, they would have landed at the laneway facing the ambush site, with volunteers either side of the road in the laneway and behind the ditch, as we now know it to be. That lane was also referenced at the time in the national newspapers. With the route established, it is hard not to mention the panic that must have overcome the ambush party when the children were released from school, around approximately 3:30. Both the Lacey family and the Connor family had family attending the school, as well as all the other men, of course, in the ambush party. As with most records, 100 years has to pass before the release. So the school records for that time, they should be out now actually. However, as most in the locality will have some memory, I have a granduncle called Bill Connor, and he was otherwise known as Cribben. He would have been of school-going age at the time. So Bill, nephew of William Connor, was in the school at the time. He was the nephew of, William's older brother, Patrick Connor. So therefore, if you put yourself in the shoes of any men in the ambush party, and you were lying in wait when the school children arrive out onto the country roads in every direction to make their way home, and one of them is your nephew, would you continue with the planned site of the ambush? Which is worse? Relocation of the planned ambush on the RIC, or the chance of your niece, nephew, or relative getting caught in the crossfire? It's just one example. Therefore, after you consider this and you multiply it by everyone in the ambush party having at least one relative leaving the school that day, that's a lot to consider. To be fair, I feel it speaks volumes about the character of the men in the ambush, and certainly differentiates from the juggery that will happen later on that night when the Black and Tans arrive in Barrowhouse. Making their way to the new location for the ambush meant the group crossing fields, but it also meant that many of the weaponry that they had ready was not in the location that they needed them to be. And so they ran with whatever they could. A raid had previously been carried out on a local RIC barracks. And from that, guns and ammunition had been robbed and received and delivered to Captain Joe Maher the night before. However, the shotguns and ammunition were buried in several locations upon delivery, and some got damp and became ineffective. And also the reliability of these shotguns could not compete with the weaponry of the RIC. As the RIC approached, the constable spotted a man running in the field with a gun, and he alerted the others in the convoy. The firing started, and one of the RIC officers was knocked from his bike, with another receiving bullets in his face. It was approximately 4 p.m. when the first sounds of gunfire of the ambush took place and could be heard throughout the area. The firing could be heard throughout Barrowhouse, with locals reporting that gunfire lasted for at least 10 minutes before silence rang out through Barrowhouse, with questions raised: what happened and to who? James Lacey and William Connor took their fatal blows in those shots, and they died at the ambush site. As per their death certificates, James took a bullet in his neck and died instantly. James was found later that day with his gun still in his hands. William took shots in his abdomen, and when he was found, he had shotguns in his possession and ammunition. Some of the ambush party tried to drag the boys away as much as they could when they were retreating. But in the end, and we understand, they had to make the tough decision to leave James and William behind. They had to run themselves. Their weaponry wasn't the same as the weaponry of the Crown. Another member of the ambush party was injured that day, but thankfully managed to limp away. The ambush party retreated down through the fields, through a bog, and is likely to fled to a safe house, as they were now all wanted men. Joe Lacey made his escape, but I cannot imagine how that moment was for him. And this is why I value the importance of looking at history with empathy. I've never heard anyone speak of the ambush and speak of how it was for Joe to witness his brother, James Lacey, being shot by Crown forces and be helpless. I know this is common in every war or rebellion, but as I reiterate, it cannot always be the logistics of a war or an attack that tells the whole story, because it's not the whole story. It is only one aspect. And we need to be more open to the stories of the people involved and what made them the people they were. Like all aspects of our road to independence, the Irish benefited from knowing their land. And the heartbreaking aspect of where Connor and Lacey lost their lives is that they were in such close proximity to their own homes. William Connor lived straight across the field overlooking the now GAA pitch, and James Lacey only down around the corner of Mountbrook. One of my favourite quotes from the military archive files is from James Lacey, Senior, upon the death of his son, and it emulates the importance that is sometimes forgotten when we discuss the ambush. That it was someone's son, and the fact they made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. James Lacey Senior states, "The great sacrifice that his country might be free, and that her country might enjoy the blessings of peace and prosperity." An article in the Nationalist then and Leinster Leader published in January 1986 is short, but it gives us an insight into the feelings that were left behind after the ambush. It was only when Jack McKenna of Castledermot visited the last surviving member of the ambush party, that the names of the men were given. In the article, the ambush group that day was alleged to be Joe Marr, which was captain of the B Company, Jack O'Brien, Joe and James Lacey, my own William Connor, Paddy Dooley, Nick Marr and Joe Ryan. In the same letter published in the paper, Jack McKenna states that Jack O'Brien discussed the last-minute change in position of the ambush due to the possible danger to the children coming home from school. That short letter indicates two main points other than what is actually being said. The first being that no one can deny the character or moral fibre of the ambush party. And I have tried to put that across throughout this talk. Secondly, at the time of the letter being published, it had been 50 years since the ambush. Well, 55 years, in fact, had passed, and only then was the names of those involved in the ambush party revealed. It suggests, and we know, that a taboo of being involved in the struggle for independence hung around till not so long ago. A Bureau of Military History established a project in the 1940s to document the stories from each brigade, battalion and company to detail Ireland's struggle for independence. But there was not one witness statement recorded from the B Company, 5th Battalion of the Carlow Brigade. Other battalions have fascinating accounts of such a turbulent time, describing the effective use of guerrilla warfare and the biggest tactic of all, knowing the land you were reared on. It's such a pity that we have no witness statements from the battalion, as we would have a deeper, more accurate level of detail on the events that day. In fact, and I love this, the Nationalist and Leinster Times dated the 21st of May 1921 stated that there was many wild stories afloat as to what really happened, but the procuring of definitive and accurate information was almost impossible. And even now, it is difficult to link up the true events of what certainly is a terrible tragedy, and that was only several days after the ambush. Therefore, it's important to note that this paper was in the same week, several days after the ambush, and the details could not be even upheld at that stage. So when we're discussing or analysing routes or particulars, there is no one can just assume that a certain route is right or wrong just because it seems to make more sense logistically. Nor should we assume who took the first bullet. The road has changed, laneways and old houses have changed, things have disappeared. But if we keep the bones of the narrative that has been passed down orally through the years, the route towards Barrowhouse Chapel has the higher probability. And as the Nationals also stated within the same article, the only tragic truths was that there was an ambush, 2 died, and that night houses were burnt. We can only rely on the sources we have, and rely on the sources we have to piece the narrative together. Heartbreakingly, the truce on the War of Independence was called on Monday, the 11th of July, 1921, 8 weeks to the day after James Lacey and William Connor died fighting the same Crown forces. The boy's body lay in the ditch. James Lacey and William Connor died fighting the same Crown forces, and the boy's body was found lying in the ditch. James Lacey's gun was across his chest. William's, as I said, was in his grip. Their bodies eventually were brought to RIC barracks, the RIC barracks in Ballylinen. And when the RIC brought the boys' bodies to the barracks, they left them in the middle of the yard in Ballylinen for all the passer-bys to see, as they hoped that the look of the locals looking at 2 local bodies of 2 men, local men, would act as a deterrent for all who should rebel against the Crown. Michael Rafter has a book, it's called The Quiet County. And he remarks in this book, and it sounded quite similar to something my grandmother used to say. So this is where you have your oral history and your folklore marrying with your documented history. But as my grandmother told my father, she heard how the officers in the RIC had joked with mockery that they killed 2 crows and they left them out in the yard. So finally, I could now believe the importance of oral history being passed down and how accurate that oral history can be. Later that night, the Black and Tans embarked on a vicious rampage throughout Barrowhouse, leaving yet another lasting impact on the community. When the men were returned to their families, it's very fitting that after the Mass, the coffins of young James and William were carried by their comrades. The 2 men were carried side by side around the church, passing the school where they once sat as young children not so long before that. The crunching of the graveyard pebbles was amplified by the marching footsteps of the comrades of James and William, but also followed by the heart-wrenching wailing of the mothers who had lost their sons. When James and William arrived at the plot at the back of Barrowhouse Church, their bodies were lowered together to the sound of the summer breeze and the fluttering trees and the tears of heartbroken families. It was then that the trumpeter played the last post at the grave to mark the final moments of 2 friends, 2 local men from the one area. The Barrowhouse Ambush really stands as an example and a testament to the resilience and determination of the Irish people during the struggle for independence. Conor and Lacey's bravery, along with those in the ambush group, and as well as those with their fellow IRA volunteers, symbolised the unwavering spirit, the Irish fight for Irish freedom against oppression. Thank you all so much for listening. I would love to have more time to explore, but I've 6-year copies to correct for the morning. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure. Oh yeah, sure. Has anybody any questions? If you don't, there's no problem.
Nessa, thank you so much for a most informative and fascinating lecture, spoken from the heart. We're now, if some people would like to ask Nessa some questions, she's happy to take them. Yes.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. I just wanted to know 2 things. One, do you know rather, what happened to the servant who stole the oaths after this? And one question. The other one is, there's a new memorial at the ambush site now, but there's an older one that's the Black Cross. How long was that there? When was it put up? Was it put up in the 1920s?
Thank you for your questions. First one, the servant, I'm actually not sure, because once it was dealt with in the Republican courts, it kind of, I suppose, got out of control from then, because the focus shifted from what he did to the boys holding a Republican court. Now, the second question I can talk for days about, because I can even go down to how many bags of concrete went into that memorial monument if you want, because I'm the blonde behind the job there. Oh, no, yes, no, I'm coming to that. So the cross that was there was done by Whelan's of the Forge. It was done by the community at the time, in the 1920s, with the 2 trees that are planted behind it. So for years, and you'd go by there and the grass would be gone wild, there'd be the little cross and the 2 trees, and that was it. So the community, after the boys died, really rallied around the families, and it was the community that put the cross there in 1920, actually not long after it, in 1921, and made it in a local forge, which was nice.
Any other questions? Yes.
Did you say that you interviewed Joseph Maher at the age of 84?
Now, I have the answer to this, because I remember sitting with my father. There's two Joe Mars in the Carlow Brigade. There was Captain Joe Mar, which I think, am I right saying that's that connection? Yeah. And then there's a second Joe Mar. And I remember there was two documents my father and I were looking at one day, and we couldn't figure out, this makes no sense. And I was saying to Daddy, there's something strange going on here. There's Joe Mars here and there's Joe Mars there. There's Joe Mar of Dunbryn, and then there was Captain Joe Mar. So it was Joe Mar of Dunbryn. He was involved in the battalion and the brigade, but he wasn't on the job the day of the ambush. So I hope that answers that. Because if I'm honest, it confused me and my father for a long time. We thought there was a double act going on, but yet you're 100% two Joe Mars.
Any other questions?
Are any of the Lacey family still around the area?
Absolutely. So with the project that went on with the memorial, it was our own family and the Lacey's joined together with some members of the community to do that. So I would have working with Pascal, which would have been the nephew of James Lacey, and we would have worked on it together to do the memorial, which was lovely because it was the two families again connecting for the two boys. And we had a lovely day where we held a ceremony for the centenary, and there were so many of the other families involved, the families of the ambush party involved were there, and I don't know, there was something kind of quite special about it. But yes, the Lacey's are still in the area too. A lot of the families, I think, are still some way in or out connected, so there's the blood goes back a long way and is still there on, I suppose, all strands.
Yes.
Thanks for this for fine talk and all your hard work. You mentioned Ford in Cullen, McGarvey.
Yeah.
Was that Brennan's Ford?
Now, this is going to be the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire situation, because I'm going to have to turn to my mother and say, Ma'am, where was McDerby's forge?
Riley's the courtyard.
Yes, yeah. So that's actually, it's a good job Mammy is here, because I wouldn't have been 100% too sure. But yeah, that's McDerby's had the forge there, and there's great stories there too, but I think that could be a lecture for another night. Any other?
Yeah, have we any other questions? Nessa has her book here as well on the Barrowhouse Ambush, and it's available for €10.
That's it, yeah.
So anybody would like a copy, Gary down there will that out for you. So the Barrowhouse Ambush, 1921. So well done on the publication as well.
Thank you very much.
At this stage, I'm going to call on Patrick for a vote of thanks, and I think I do, the Dooley family was mentioned as well, so I presume there's a connection there.
Yeah.
Okay, it gives me fantastic pleasure to propose a vote of thanks to Nessa for a fantastic lecture. Told us a story rather than factual history. I think that was the nice part of it. Showed empathy, it showed everything about it. I first heard of Barrowhouse Ambush back in the 1990s from Paddy Dooley she referred to, who was the first husband of my dad's. Again, it was new to me at that stage, and I had never heard of ambushes up in that area. And I knew my family from the area, but didn't know any involvement in what was, the ambush out there. At the time, I was a young man, and Paddy said to me, "We'll go out one day for a spin," and off we went. And he brought me to the ambush site and explained what the two trees were, the significance of the two trees that the other members of the party planted after the deaths of Mr. O'Connor and Mr. Lacey. And at the time, I had an old cassette tape recorder sitting on the back seat and recorded what he told me. Sadly, the tape is no longer in existence, but I remember a lot of the story. When Nessa was doing her research, I was delighted that she contacted me about what she was doing, and I think it's a wonderful story, and we've all heard the story tonight. I do recommend the book because I bought it tonight. And as I say, it gives me great pleasure on behalf of Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society thank you, I propose formally the vote of thanks. And present you with a small gift, a token from the society.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's a lot. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you again, Nessa. And just one or two housekeeping exercises, really. This is the last lecture for before the summer break. Our next lecture will be in September, and that will be on Thomas Dingley's visit to Carlow. That will be in the Talbot Hotel. If you would like to become a member of the society, many of you are members, but Gary again will help you with that, and you'd have a word with him if you'd like to become a member, and we would be pleased, of course, if you did. We don't charge for these lectures, but if you would like to leave a small donation, that would be gratefully received. So thank you so much again for coming to our last lecture before the summer. Thank you so much, Nessa. It's been a terrific lecture, and we very much, I enjoyed is probably not the right word, but we're very much more informed, and you gave us a very heartfelt account of what took place at the Barrowhouse Ambush. And in this time of commemoration, it's important that we mark these and remember these events that were the formation, I suppose, of our state as such. Of course, most of all, they were events that touched so many families, we can only imagine what it must have been like for them to lose loved ones in difficult situations like that. So Lisa, thank you so much, and thank you to your mum as well for coming along. Thank you to Helen who organises the lectures, and thank you all for coming this evening, and we wish you a very safe journey home.